At 5:45 p.m. on October 24, 1998, a building that had once employed 12,000 people and served 100,000 customers a day collapsed into a 60-foot pile of rubble in 30 seconds. The J.L. Hudson Department Store, 25 stories tall, 2 million square feet, the tallest department store ever built, was imploded at the exact minute the store used to close for the evening. Downtown Detroit was coated in a fine gray dust that settled on the empty sidewalks, on the parking lots that had replaced the neighboring shops, on the few remaining office workers who had come outside to watch. The flag that Hudson's had hung each year from its Woodward Avenue facade, 3,700 square feet of stars and stripes, requiring a mile of rope and a team of 55 men, had been donated to the Smithsonian years earlier. The Smithsonian sent it to the American Flag Foundation in Houston. It was destroyed there for lack of preservation in 1990. The building followed 8 years later, and when the dust cleared, there was nothing on that block but steel girders poking from a concrete slab, the same block where, in 1953, the store had averaged 100,000 sales transactions every single day. The site of that implosion sits at the intersection of Woodward Avenue and Gratiot, two of the great spoke-like boulevards that have radiated from the center of Detroit since 1807. Woodward Avenue is the oldest and most important of them, the city's spine, its parade route, its measure of ambition. Every era of Detroit's life was built along Woodward or within sight of it: the fur trading post, the territorial capital, the railroad hub, the automobile empire, the arsenal that won a world war. And every era's decline was visible there too, in the shuttered storefronts and empty theaters and crumbling facades that lined the avenue for decades. To understand Detroit, you walk Woodward. You start at the river and you go north. And the story you encounter is one of the most extraordinary urban trajectories in the history of the Western Hemisphere. On July 24th, 1701, a French military officer named Antoine de la Mode Cadillac landed on the north bank of the Detroit River with roughly 100 soldiers and 100 Algonquin allies. They had traveled by birch bark canoe from Montreal, up the Ottawa River, across Lake Nipissing, through Georgian Bay, down Lake Huron, and finally through the narrow strait that the French called Le Detroit, the place where Lakes Huron and Erie are connected by a channel roughly half a mile wide. Cadillac chose the narrowest point, a high bluff on the north shore, easy to defend and impossible to pass without being seen. He named the stockade Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, honoring the French naval minister who had approved the expedition. The fort was built from white oak, enclosed less than an acre, and its palisade stood about 12 feet tall. Cadillac was ambitious, corrupt, and not well liked. He had previously commanded Fort Michilimackinac in the Mackinac Straits and had profited handsomely from the fur trade there. He imposed arbitrary fees on settlers, kept soldiers on short rations, and controlled the brandy trade to his personal advantage. By 1710, his unpopularity was so severe that the French government reassigned him to the undesirable post of governor of Louisiana. He never returned to Detroit. The settlement he left behind was tiny, a few hundred French souls clustered inside or immediately around the fort, living among several thousand Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi who had established villages nearby. The entire European community occupied an area equivalent to a single modern city block, bounded by the present-day streets of Griswold, Fort, Shelby, and Larned. For the next 50 years, Detroit clung to existence as a frontier outpost. In 1740, its population was not much different from what it had been in 1701. The fort changed hands without a shot during the French and Indian War. The British took control on November 29, 1760, after the fall of Montreal. 3 years later, the Ottawa war chief Pontiac besieged the fort for months, but could not take it. The British held Detroit through the American Revolution and beyond, not surrendering it to the United States until 1796, 13 years after the Treaty of Paris had technically ended the war. When the Americans finally arrived, they found a modest, French-speaking village of perhaps 800 European residents, their ribbon farms stretching back from the river in narrow strips, some as long as 3 miles. Then, on the morning of June 11th, 1805, a baker named John Harvey, or perhaps his hired hand, tapped out a pipe, and a crimson ember sailed into a pile of hay. The wind was violent that Tuesday morning. Flames tore from one wooden building to the next. A bucket brigade formed at the river, and an old British fire engine was dragged toward the blaze, but neither could keep pace. Within 6 hours, every structure in Detroit was destroyed except the stone Fort Lerneau on the hill above town and a single warehouse on the riverbank. Remarkably, no one died, but more than a century of construction was gone. What rose from those ashes would define the shape of modern Detroit. Just 3 weeks after the fire, a young judge from Washington named Augustus Brevoort Woodward arrived to take his post as the first Chief Justice of the newly created Michigan Territory. President Thomas Jefferson had appointed him. Woodward was eccentric, slovenly, brilliant, and visionary. Contemporaries described him sleeping in his dirty office, keeping a glass of brandy on the bench before him, and dismissing all precedent. Governor William Hull appointed Woodward a committee of one to devise a plan for rebuilding the city. The judge proposed something no American city had attempted: a street plan based on repeating hexagonal blocks with broad avenues radiating from central plazas, inspired by L'Enfant's Washington, but more geometrically ambitious. The main thoroughfares would be 200 feet wide, lined with elliptical groves of trees. Secondary streets would be 120 feet. At every major intersection, a grand circus, a public gathering space. The plan was never fully realized. Impatient residents began building before the survey was finished. Governor Lewis Cass eventually overruled Woodward in 1817, platting 10,000 acres of surrounding countryside in a conventional Midwestern grid. But the bones of Woodward's vision survived in the heart of the city: the 6 great avenues: Woodward, Michigan, Grand River, Gratiot, Jefferson, and Fort, radiating from Campus Martius like spokes from a wheel. Grand Circus Park remains. The avenues remain. And that original act of civic imagination, a city designed not merely for convenience but for grandeur, set a tone that Detroit would follow for more than a century. Within 15 years of the fire, Detroit's population had more than doubled. Michigan became a state in 1837, with Detroit as its first capital. The city's economy shifted from fur trading to supplying an agricultural state, and then, in the decades after the Civil War, to manufacturing. By 1880, Detroit's population had reached 116,000. Stove manufacturing, iron and steel, railroad cars, pharmaceuticals, tobacco, the city's factories turned out a remarkable range of goods. But the transformation that would make Detroit unlike any city on earth was about to begin, and it started in a brick shed behind a house on Bagley Avenue. In the spring of 1896, a 32-year-old engineer named Henry Ford completed his first gasoline-powered vehicle, a lightweight contraption he called the quadricycle, in a small workshop behind his home at 58 Bagley Avenue. The shed's door was too narrow for the vehicle, so Ford took a sledgehammer to the brick frame and widened the opening. He drove the quadricycle through the streets of Detroit at roughly 4 miles per hour. It was not the first automobile built in the city. Ransom Olds and Charles King had both preceded him. But Ford's obsession with making cars affordable would reshape not just Detroit, but the entire structure of American life. What is less remembered is what happened to that little workshop on Bagley Avenue. The garage was eventually disassembled by Ford himself and moved to his museum in Dearborn. In 1926, a 4,000-seat movie palace called the Michigan Theater was built on the very site where the quadricycle had been assembled. And decades later, when the Michigan Theater could no longer survive as a theater, it was converted into a parking garage. Cars now park beneath its ornate plaster ceilings and crystal chandeliers, the birthplace of Ford's first automobile reclaimed, with a kind of unintentional poetry, by the automobile itself. Ford founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903 and began producing the Model T in 1908 at the Piquette Avenue plant, a modest 3-story factory in what would become Detroit's new center area. The Model T sold for $850. Ford wanted it cheaper. In 1907, he purchased 130 acres in the enclave of Highland Park, entirely surrounded by the city of Detroit, and hired a young architect named Albert Kahn to design a new factory. Kahn, who had arrived in Detroit from Germany in 1880 at the age of 11, had no formal education past elementary school. What he had was an instinct for industrial space. He and his brother Julius had pioneered the use of reinforced concrete in factory construction, creating vast open interiors flooded with natural light. The Highland Park plant, completed in 1910, was a 4-story structure running 865 feet parallel to Woodward Avenue, its walls and roof composed almost entirely of glass. Workers called it the Crystal Palace. What happened inside that building on October 7, 1913, changed the world. Ford and his engineers implemented the first continuously moving assembly line for automobile production. The time required to assemble a single Model T dropped from 728 minutes to 93. Production surged from hundreds of cars per day to thousands. The price of the Model T fell from $700 in 1910 to $350 by 1917. A car that had been a luxury was becoming something an ordinary worker could own. But the assembly line created a problem Ford had not anticipated. Workers despised it. The labor was monotonous, the pace relentless. By late 1913, annual labor turnover at Highland Park had reached 380%. Men would work a few weeks and quit. Ford's response, announced on January 5, 1914, was as revolutionary as the assembly line itself. He more than doubled the minimum daily wage from $2.34 to $5 and reduced the workday from 9 hours to 8. The business press predicted bankruptcy. Instead, the turnover rate plummeted from over 30% in 1913 to 1.4% by 1915, and the announcement set off a migration that would transform Detroit's demographics within a single generation. Mechanics, laborers, and farm hands from across the country descended on the city. Detroit's population, which had been roughly 286,000 in 1900, vaulted to nearly 1 million by 1920, making it the 4th largest city in the United States. By 1930, it had reached 1.57 million. The men and women who streamed into Detroit found a city being rebuilt at a speed that defied comprehension. Albert Kahn's firm alone designed 1,900 buildings over the course of his career, including factories, office towers, hospitals, and private homes. In 1937, his firm was responsible for 19% of all architect-designed industrial buildings in the entire United States. His client list reads like a roster of American capitalism: Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Packard, Burroughs. For Ford, he designed not only the Highland Park plant, but the staggering River Rouge complex in Dearborn, 2,000 acres along the Rouge River, construction beginning in 1917, 93 buildings totaling nearly 16 million square feet of factory floor, a workforce that at its peak exceeded 100,000. Raw materials, iron ore, coal, limestone, rubber, sand, entered at one end. Finished automobiles rolled out the other. One new car every 49 seconds. Each day, workers smelted more than 1,500 tons of iron and produced 500 tons of glass. A maintenance crew of 5,000 kept it clean. Ford had envisioned a factory so self-sufficient it was essentially a city without residents. The money generated by the auto industry built a parallel city of staggering ambition above ground. The 1920s were Detroit's decade of skyscrapers, and they arrived with a velocity that rivaled Manhattan's. The Book Cadillac Hotel opened in 1924, designed by Louis Camper, 33 stories, 1,136 rooms, all with private baths, the world's tallest hotel at the time of its completion. Its opening night gala entertained 2,000 guests with a feast prepared by 200 French chefs. The Book brothers, Herbert, Frank, and J. Burgess, Jr., had been born in the old Cadillac Hotel that previously occupied the site and were intent on making Washington Boulevard Detroit's most opulent retail corridor. A few blocks north, the General Motors building, designed by Kahn, opened in 1922 as the second largest office building in the world, anchoring the new Center District 3 miles up Woodward Avenue from Campus Martius. Then came 1928, A single year that reshaped Detroit's skyline more dramatically than any 12 months in the city's history. The Fox Theater opened on Woodward Avenue near Grand Circus Park. Designed by C. Howard Crane, more than 5,000 seats, the largest surviving movie palace of the 1920s. Its 6-story lobby featuring a 3,000-pound wool rug on the floor and faux organ pipes fashioned from plaster above the entrance. The theater routinely grossed $75,000 a week when admission was 35 cents. During World War II, the Fox operated 24 hours a day to accommodate defense plant workers on afternoon and evening shifts. The Penobscot Building rose on Griswold Street, 47 stories of Art Deco limestone designed by Wirt Rowland, its rooftop beacon visible for miles. Rowland also designed the Guardian Building, completed the following year, a skyscraper so lavishly decorated with Pewabic pottery tiles and colored terracotta that it was sometimes called the Cathedral of Finance. And the Fisher Building opened in the New Center, Albert Kahn's masterpiece, a 30-story tower sheathed almost entirely in granite and marble, its lobby a cathedral of mosaics, painted barrel vault ceilings and bronze fixtures. The Fisher brothers, 7 of them, all sons of a blacksmith from Norwalk, Ohio, had built their fortune manufacturing car bodies. Body by Fisher was stamped on nearly every General Motors vehicle. They sold Fisher Body to GM and used the proceeds to build their monument. The Architectural League awarded the Fisher Building its silver medal. The original plan called for twin 30-story towers flanking a 60-story central spire, but the stock market crash of 1929 killed the second tower, and the spire was never started. To walk Woodward Avenue in 1929 was to walk through one of the most commercially vibrant corridors in America. At its southern end, near Campus Martius, the Hudson's Department Store sprawled across an entire city block, by then a growing colossus that would eventually reach 25 stories and over 2 million square feet, the second largest department store in the country behind only Macy's Herald Square. Hudson's 5 restaurants served thousands of meals daily. Its delivery department operated 300 trucks with 500 drivers. On the 12th floor each Christmas, the store erected a winter wonderland with a merry-go-round, a small Ferris wheel, and a magic forest surrounding Santa Claus. In 1924, Hudson's had launched its own Thanksgiving Day parade, 2 years before Macy's started theirs. Heading north on Woodward, past Sanders Confectionery and the Kearns and Crowley's department stores, past the grand movie palaces clustered around Grand Circus Park, past the Detroit Institute of Arts and the Detroit Public Library facing each other across the avenue and the Cultural Center, both built in the 1920s, you would eventually reach the Fisher Building's Golden Tower, visible from downtown, its lobby echoing with the footsteps of office workers and theater-goers heading into the Fisher Theater, whose Mayan-inspired interior featured hieroglyphic figures along the ceiling and seats upholstered in golden olive velvet. Detroit in 1929 had the highest per capita income in the United States. The auto industry's wages had created a city where working-class families owned their own homes at rates that astounded the rest of the country. Mile after mile of tidy brick bungalows spread outward from the factory districts. Neighborhoods like Rosedale Park and Palmer Woods and Boston Edison, where the auto magnates themselves built mansions. The Dodge brothers lived on Arden Park Boulevard. J.L. Hudson had a residence there, too. Fred Fisher, the founder of Fisher Body, built an Italian villa in Indiana limestone on the same street. The city's population had grown more than 1,000-fold in just over a century, from the handful of French traders behind Cadillac's stockade to a metropolis of 1.5 million. Between 1900 and 1930, the population had more than quintupled. The sound of Detroit in those years was unmistakable. Streetcars clanged down Woodward every few minutes. The electric trolley system that had replaced horse-drawn cars at the turn of the century hummed through the commercial district and out to the neighborhoods. The Rouge Complex alone consumed more electricity than many American cities. At the docks along the Detroit River, freighters unloaded iron ore from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota, and the river itself, once a quiet French trading route, had become the busiest commercial waterway in the world. carrying more tonnage annually than the Suez and Panama canals combined. Along Jefferson Avenue, the auto barons had built their mansions in the last decades of the 19th century, but by the 1920s, the avenue was being overtaken by factories and apartment buildings as the wealthy moved farther north. The city was consuming itself with growth, pushing its boundaries outward through a series of large annexations between 1921 and 1926 that filled out the northwest and northeast quadrants, a burst of territorial expansion that a change in Michigan law would effectively end in 1926. The city reached its full geographic extent at 139 square miles before many of those newly annexed neighborhoods had even been built. And then came the city's motto, words coined after the fire of 1805 by Father Gabriel Richard, Speramus meliora, resurged cineribus. We hope for better things. It will rise from the ashes. The words were engraved on the city seal in 1827. They would be invoked again and again in the decades ahead, though their meaning would shift from celebration to something closer to a plea. The Depression hit Detroit with particular violence. Car sales collapsed, unemployment soared. The Book brothers lost the Book Cadillac Hotel. Ford cut wages, but the city's industrial infrastructure, its factories, its skilled labor force, its network of tool and die shops, was about to be repurposed on a scale no one had imagined. On December 29, 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered a fireside chat in which he called upon America to become the great arsenal of democracy. He might as well have been speaking directly to Detroit. William Knudsen, the president of General Motors, had already been installed as the nation's chairman of military production, accepting a government salary of $1. Knudsen addressed the most powerful auto executives in the country at the 1940 New York Auto Show with a simple directive. Gentlemen, we must outbuild Hitler. At the time, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world in size, just behind Portugal. What followed was the most dramatic industrial conversion in history. Automakers stopped building cars entirely and turned their assembly lines to war production. Chrysler broke ground on the Detroit Arsenal tank plant in Warren, Michigan. The first M3 tank rolled off the line before the factory walls were even fully erected. Engineers brought in a steam locomotive to heat the building during the brutal Michigan winter of 1940. By December 1942, the Arsenal's 5,000 workers set an all-time monthly record by producing 907 Sherman tanks. 91% of all Army helmets manufactured during the war were stamped in Detroit. But the most audacious project was Ford's. In the spring of 1941, Charlie Sorensen, Ford's production chief, sketched the B-24 Liberator bomber on a hotel notepad in San Diego and told Edsel Ford, Henry's only son, that his people could build one every hour. Aviation experts said it was impossible. Ford had never built a four-engine bomber. Construction began on the Willow Run Bomber Plant in Ypsilanti, 30 miles west of downtown Detroit, and when completed, it was the largest factory under a single roof in the world, 1 mile long, 3.5 million square feet. Albert Kahn, who had designed so many of the buildings that defined Detroit's skyline, drew the plans for Willow Run. It was his last major project. He died in December 1942. Willow Run spent most of its first year failing. Production was agonizingly slow. The press mocked it as "Will it run?" But by the end of 1943, the plant was producing bombers at the rate of 1 per hour. At its peak, 42,000 people worked there. Buses made 35 daily round trips from Detroit. Workers shared beds and shifts because housing near the plant could not keep up with demand. The federal government built dormitories on nearby farmland. By the time the last B-24 rolled off the line on June 28, 1945, Willow Run had produced 8,685 bombers. The Detroit area accounted for roughly 30% of all war materiel produced in the United States during the conflict, more than any other American city. As many as 350,000 workers had migrated to Detroit to fill factory jobs, straining housing, transit, and municipal services to their limits. The war's end left Detroit at the zenith of its power and the threshold of its unraveling. The population peaked at 1.85 million in the 1950 census. Residents enjoyed the highest per capita income in the country. A typical Ford worker earned an annual wage more than twice the national median. The homeownership rate was among the highest of any American city. Detroit had a lower poverty rate than its own suburbs. If you had stood at Campus Martius in 1950 and looked up Woodward Avenue, you would have seen a scene of extraordinary commercial density. Pedestrians streaming in and out of Hudson's, office workers pouring from the Penobscot and Guardian buildings at the end of the day, the marquees of a dozen movie theaters glowing in the early dark, streetcars still running. In 1956, the streetcars would be gone, replaced by buses, a decision that stripped the avenue of the electric infrastructure that had defined it for half a century. The year 1954 marked a hinge point, though few recognized it at the time. That March, Hudson's opened its first suburban branch at the Northland Center in Southfield. When it opened, it was the largest shopping center in the nation. The logic was straightforward. Detroit's metropolitan population had swollen to nearly 4 million. Many of them living in new suburbs with wide lawns and two-car garages and no desire to fight downtown traffic. Hudson's brought the store to them. Downtown sales would peak and then begin their long slide. That same year, downtown Hudson's recorded sales of $163 million. Within 2 decades, the suburban branches would be generating the bulk of the company's revenue, while the flagships sat increasingly empty on the upper floors. But the seeds of decline had already been planted, and some of them had been planted by the very infrastructure the war had created. The freeways built to move workers to wartime factories, the Davison, the Detroit Industrial Expressway that would become Interstate 94, demonstrated that factories could be built far from the city center, and workers could be transported to them. The suburban pattern was established. When post-war prosperity arrived, the auto companies began building new plants not in Detroit but in the surrounding counties, in places where land was cheap and unions were weaker. In 1950, 56% of all automobile manufacturing employment in the United States was in Michigan. By 1960, that had dropped to 40%. The jobs were leaving, and the people followed. The racial dimension of Detroit's transformation cannot be separated from its economic one. During the Great Migration, thousands of black families from the American South had come to Detroit seeking factory work and freedom from Jim Crow. In 1910, roughly 6,000 black residents lived in the city. By 1930, there were more than 120,000. They were met with restrictive housing covenants, segregated neighborhoods, and occasional violence. In 1943, a race riot lasting 3 days killed 34 people and required federal troops with armored cars to restore order. The underlying tensions never resolved. When black families began moving into previously white neighborhoods in the 1950s, white residents left, not gradually, but in a torrent. 22,000 white Detroiters departed in 1966 alone. Then came July 1967. A police raid on an unlicensed after-hours club on 12th Street sparked 5 days of violence. 43 people killed, over 400 injured, thousands of small businesses destroyed. The National Guard and federal paratroopers occupied the streets. The white exodus that had been steady became frantic. 67,000 left in the remaining months of 1967, 80,000 in 1968. The 1970 census recorded 839,000 white residents. By 2010, only 76,000 remained. Each departure shrank the tax base. Each closed factory eliminated wages that would have been spent in local stores. In 1960, a high school student named Diana Ross was hired as Hudson's first black bus girl. The same year, Berry Gordy, Jr. was building Motown Records in a small house on West Grand Boulevard, just a few blocks from the Fisher Building, in a neighborhood that was still humming with life. Gordy had borrowed $800 from his family to start the label. Within a few years, the Supremes, the Temptations, Stevie Wonder, and Marvin Gaye would make Detroit the capital of American popular music, even as the city's manufacturing base was beginning to hollow out. But the music could not replace the factory wages. Hudson's, which had recorded sales of $163 million in 1954, over $1 billion in today's money, began consolidating selling space in the 1970s. The suburban branches, with their free parking and their proximity to the customers who had fled, were thriving. The downtown flagship was not. Hudson's closed on January 17, 1983. The Book Cadillac Hotel, which had hosted Lou Gehrig on the night he ended his consecutive game streak in 1939, shut its doors in 1984 after decades of declining occupancy. Michigan Central Station, designed by Warren and Wetmore, the same architects behind Grand Central Terminal in New York, opened in 1913 with a waiting room 97 feet wide and 230 feet long beneath vaulted ceilings with bronze chandeliers, an 18-story office tower rising above it, more than 4,000 passengers passing through daily at its peak. The station closed on January 6, 1988. The last Amtrak train pulled out and the building sat empty. 30 years of rain, snow, vandalism, and neglect followed. The chandeliers were stolen. The marble was stripped. Entering the abandoned station became a rite of passage for young Detroiters. One art student later compared it to visiting a museum. The Michigan Theater, that 4,000-seat palace built on the site of Ford's first workshop, had closed as a theater in the 1970s. Its conversion to a parking garage left the auditorium's ornate plaster work and painted ceilings intact above rows of parked sedans. Visitors who saw the building in its final decades as a theater tend to mention the same thing: the 10-foot crystal chandeliers still hanging 8 stories above, swaying imperceptibly as cars rolled in beneath them. On July 18, 2013, Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The city carried an estimated $18 billion in debt, including a $3.5 billion pension shortfall. Its population had fallen below 700,000, down from the 1950 peak of 1.85 million. The unemployment rate stood at 16%. The city that had once boasted the highest per capita income in America now had a median household income roughly half the state average. The financial mechanics of the collapse were as methodical as the assembly line that had built the city's wealth. As population fell, property tax revenue fell with it. As the tax base shrank, the city raised rates on those who remained, driving more residents and businesses out, which further eroded the base. City services deteriorated. Police response time stretched past an hour. Streetlights went dark across entire neighborhoods. At one point, roughly 40% of the city's streetlights were not functioning. The city borrowed to cover operating deficits, which increased its debt service, which consumed a larger share of diminishing revenues. It was an arithmetic spiral that no amount of civic willpower could reverse without outside intervention. There are quiet facts embedded in the landscape that tell the story as clearly as any financial statement. The city of Detroit covers 139 square miles. You could fit San Francisco, Boston, and Manhattan inside it with room to spare. In the 2010 census, its population density had fallen so low that entire neighborhoods had more vacant lots than occupied houses. The Packard plant, another Kahn creation, built in 1903, once one of the most advanced automotive factories in the world, closed in 1958 and sat abandoned for decades, its 35 acres of reinforced concrete slowly being reclaimed by trees and weather. The Broderick Tower downtown stood empty from 1985 to 2012. The Metropolitan Building, a neo-Gothic jewel on John R. Street, was vacant from 1979 to 2020. And yet Woodward Avenue is still there. It still runs from the river to Pontiac, the spoke that Augustus Woodward laid in 1805 from the ashes of a fire. The Fisher Building's Golden Tower still rises at Grand Boulevard, its lobby mosaics cleaned and restored. The Fox Theater, which survived the 1970s by showing martial arts and blaxploitation films when every other downtown theater had closed, was fully restored in 1988. Mike Ilitch, the founder of Little Caesars, bought it for a reported $12 million and spent another $50 million on renovation. Ford Motor Company purchased Michigan Central Station in 2018 and spent $950 million restoring it. sourcing 600 tons of limestone from the same Indiana quarry that Warren and Wetmore had used in 1913, a quarry that had itself been closed since the 1980s and was reopened specifically for the project. The station welcomed the public again in June 2024, 36 years after the last train departed. On the block where Hudson's once stood, steel and glass are rising again. A new development, office towers, retail, event space, is under construction on the 2-acre site. General Motors, which left its Kahn-designed headquarters in the new center for the Renaissance Center on the riverfront in 1996, has announced it will move its corporate offices into the new Hudson's building. The company that Albert Kahn built a home for in 1922 will occupy a structure on the site where J.L. Hudson opened his first full store in 1891. The corner of Woodward and Gratiot is no longer an empty slab, but if you stand there and look north up the avenue, past Campus Martius, past Grand Circus Park, past the restored theaters and the new streetcar line that opened in 2017, the Fisher Building's tower is still visible in the distance, its golden peak catching the late afternoon light the same way it did in September 1928, when the Detroit News wrote that it had taken its proper place in the city's skyline. The marble in its lobby is the same marble. The mosaics are the same mosaics. The building was designed to last, and it has lasted, though nearly everything around it has been demolished, abandoned, rebuilt, or transformed beyond recognition. The tower stands there a few miles north, golden and quiet, waiting, as it has been waiting, for whatever Detroit decides to become next.